Boom! Bernhard Carlos Schär, welcome to you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And that's a bit funny today because a French speaker and a German speaker are going to speak in English. We don't really like that normally in Switzerland. We tend to use our own languages, but for many reasons, we decided today to be international.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity.
So you're a historian, journalist a long time ago, and now professor at the University of Lausanne, l'UNIL.
Right.
So can you maybe tell a little bit more about you and what you do to start with?
Well, I have one of those, they're called Eccellenza professorships. So those are professorships that are awarded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And basically my job is at the moment to be the head, or have the privilege to be the head of an international research group consisting of various colleagues here in Lausanne, but we also collaborate with colleagues in Brazil, South Africa and India. And what we are trying to do is to kind of rewrite the history of modern Switzerland in the 19th century from a global perspective. And I think what this means, this is probably what we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. At school, when I was at school, I didn't like history. I think it was kind of boring. But now that I'm maybe more inclined to put an eye on it, I discovered that there's a lot of stuff I was not told. And I had an interview a few months ago with Sébastien.
Yeah,
exactly.
One of my former colleagues at the University of Lausanne, yeah.
Absolutely.
Pioneer on the field of Swiss imperial and colonial history, yes.
Absolutely. And I learned that Switzerland was also acting as an imperial state sometimes and somehow. And that's great to have you to follow up this discussion, this time in English, because with Sébastien Gay, for the one who don't speak English, maybe they should listen to that episode. But then we can start with that. What important things I don't know about Swiss imperialism or colonialism even. We didn't touch colonialism, I think. So what is there that we should all know that we don't really know?
I think in a nutshell, I would say Switzerland, and I would say this goes for any nation, not only Switzerland. Switzerland's no special case, but in a nutshell, Switzerland, like all other nations, first it was globalized, and then became a modern nation state. So, usually the way we tell the story in Switzerland is 1848, which is also, we're celebrating this year because it's kind of like an anniversary. That is when the Swiss federal constitution was written, which established the federal state that we are still living in today. But I think it's important to realize that long before this date, which is important for Swiss history or for Swiss national history, Switzerland in many ways was, as I mentioned, already globalized, so present not only within Europe, beyond the Swiss territory, but also in the Americas, North and South America, Africa, Asia, and also the Pacific island world, for example. And so, as I mentioned, this is not something particularly Swiss. I think this then is in line with a great paradigm shift, a general paradigm shift that has taken place in history writing in the recent years. So the problem that we had before, and it's still a problem that haunts us in history writing, is it's the category of the nation. So normally the way we told the story, okay, every nation has its own history. There's the history, German history, there's French history, there's British history, Spanish history, Austrian history, and there's also Swiss history, etc. and so forth. And then the narrative was, well, these nations, they kind of evolved more or less independently from each other in their own separate boxes, and then eventually they started to interact, and this then often was called international history, so the history of nations interacting with each other. But I think through, this huge paradigm shift that took, it's not only in historiography, in academia, but I think in society at large, which was really brought about, one should say, not in the university lecture halls, but maybe more on the streets, I would say, with decolonization in the 1960s and 70s, and also many activists and civil rights movements in the USA, etc., and so forth. They have really forced also, I would say, the academic establishment to re-examine history and to appreciate or to really take serious the fact that before these European nations evolved, mostly in the 19th century, for centuries before, if it takes Portugal or Spain, from the 15th, 16th century onwards, they were empires, right? So they were a history of European nations never evolved only on this continent. It was always present also on other continents, and not in a, let's say, friendly exchange, democratic exchange, but this was part of imperialism, which involved violence, of course, and conquest and exploitation, and this is nothing unique to European powers. I mean, in the early modern world, there coexisted with these European powers many non-European powers. I mean, the Ottoman Empire being extremely important, but we had also the Mughal Empire in India. Great Aztec empires, the Inca empires in Latin America, great empires also in Africa. But, I mean, to make a long story short, I mean, we did see then these European powers, these European empires really gradually growing more and more powerful, and which what's something that really characterized this empire is, the fact of racism. So the idea that inherently, apparently the Swiss, not the Swiss, European, but also the Swiss, and so these European cultures and civilizations thought themselves to be superior to all the other societies, which then kind of served to legitimize not only the exploitation, oftentimes also the violent physical destructions, I mean, almost like genocides, but also then destructions of cultures, of non-European cultures, and this attempt to really Europeanize the world and turn it into, exploit it for European ends. And this is the large story, and I think this is just gives then the bigger context. I think it's important to understand, to take also the first bird's eye views, maybe look at the world from like sitting on the moon and see, okay, well, how does this history of this world evolve, and politically, or how is power organized? And then I think, we can really appreciate the fact, okay, the main movers and shakers of this history, I mean, we talk about political power, it's about empires. And then, of course, for us, small minority that we are here in Switzerland, I mean, less than, 1% of the world population, of course, we have a particular interest in, well, what does this mean for us, small country in the heart of Europe? But I think it helps us to understand, to see the bigger picture, and then I think it becomes quite clear, or it's nothing really, I would say, surprising or astonishing that, of course, I mean, this territory that we are living in today, of course, is also a product of this huge process of European imperial expansion.
You mentioned that the foundation of colonialism and expansion is racism, and the way that we think we somehow are superior than others. But is this condition inherited to humankind always? Like I think we still think that, but in different form. It's not. Would you say we are less racist now than we were in like when we were operating?
Well, maybe yes. I mean, in a way, I mean, racism has its own history, so it changes, and it has the different. I mean, in scholarship, we speak of racisms in the plural. But I mean, to your first question, is it like kind of like an a part of the human condition? No, I think it's very, very important to really emphasize. No, it's nothing natural. It's nothing inborn. People are not necessarily born with racism. People become racist, and it's a historical phenomenon. So too, yeah. Because I mean. Of course, I mean, if you look at other empires, non-European empires, I mean, there's always exploitation, there's always hierarchy, there's always violence. But this idea that all other civilizations and cultures must kind of submit themselves to become European in a sense. I think this is really something that distinguishes the European empires. In the Japanese case, the late is kind of a special case because the Japanese empire becomes late. But if you look at, just have a quick look at the Ottoman Empire, which is an important empire because it coexisted so long with the European empires, and it was kind of our neighbor, right? I mean, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, culturally it functioned in a totally different way. So you had like a huge tolerance and also plurality, not only within Islam, so many different kinds of Islam kind of coexisting with each other, right? But then also, I mean, large communities of Christians, of Jews, and of other kind of how do you say, cultures, yes, because I mean the term religion didn't really even exist then yet. It was kind of not a big thing. So there's many different ways of living, but also many different ways of spirituality and believing in ghosts or in gods that kind of coexists. For example, in the Ottoman Empire and many of the other European empires. So I mean, this is one example. Then we can see this insistence that there is only one God, there's only one way of believing, only one way of seeing the world. I think, which is kind of part of this European imperial project, or the cultural dimension at least. I think this is very, very European, and this is a form of racism. And of course, racism has evolved. It has changed a lot since, let's say, the 15th, 16th century until now. Definitely, yeah.
Also, because we are more embedded with what we consider foreign. Because I think the racism of all time is like we didn't know anything, so we were scared of the other because we didn't know anything. But now we kind of know. We cannot say we don't know anymore. So the nature maybe has changed, but this idea of superiority could still be felt. And I think I can hear that national discourse, nationalistic discourse. We are the best, and USA first. I mean, the USA, the language is still so deeply colored with that notion of exceptionalism.
Exceptionalism, yes.
Which is the same, basically. And you can see, I was wondering if this imperialist behavior is linked to the power you have. And if any state had the power of the USA, then it will become as imperialistic than the USA. But in Switzerland, we're very small. We are kind of harmless because of the size. And therefore, we are not seemingly, but you're going to maybe tell otherwise with the history, purchasing an imperialist vision because we can't.
Yeah, in a sense. If I may just return to something you said before, which I think is extremely important. I mean, I think if I understood you correctly, and you're right about this, I mean, in a sense. I mean, before, of course, I mean, if you look at Europe in the 16th, 17th century, the 18th century, 19th century, depending on which parts of Europe, it was much more homogeneous than it is now, of course. There were not many non-European people living among us. So, yes, on one hand, yes, but on the other hand, then I would also say no. I mean, because giving this imperial expansion, I mean, of course, beginning, I would say, I mean, most historians would kind of say beginnings. It's always difficult, the beginnings, but let's say 16th century, the so-called discovery of the Americas, and also then the discovery of the, voyage, the route around South Africa to India.
It's funny to say discovery because
it's so-called. It's not a discovery. I mean, it's Europeans discovered it, but the people who lived there, of course, they knew all along that the Americas exist. Of course, they didn't call it the Americas. But I think the point I wanted to make is, I mean, so let's say the Europeans who stayed at home in Europe, I mean, they always knew, they always had images, they always had a certain kind of knowledge of, the realities beyond Europe, because the Europeans went abroad. I mean, they wrote back letters, they came back, they brought all these exotic specimens, animals, sometimes also always people, they published books. I mean, this, just to interject some Swiss history here. I mean, this was also then the time that the printing press was invented, and places like Basel, but also Geneva and other places here in Switzerland, they became huge European centers for book printing. And many of the books that also are printed here in Geneva, in Basel and elsewhere, then also provided information of these new so-called discoveries, first of all in the Americas and then later on in the Pacific, etc. and so forth. So in a certain sense, Europeans, even if they never went kind of left their continent, they were always, in a sense, informed, or they always had ideas of the non-European world. So I think then, this then led to kind of a very, very difficult and problematic history then in the 20th century with decolonization. So then I think what happened is, I mean, in scholarship, we talk of kind of like historical amnesia, or so the idea of after kind of decolonization and kind of the end of these great European empires, all this history kind of miraculously, almost from one day to the other, was forgotten. Kind of, we forgot. We were always peaceful nation states. Let's establish the European Union, this peace building project. And I don't want to deride it. I mean, it's a complicated and complicated history. But anyway, so this kind of sense of it's only now that due to migration, because more and more people from Africa, from Asian countries, from Latin American countries are coming here to Europe. It's only now that we are kind of realizing that we're not alone in the world, and that we should kind of reconsider our attitudes toward them, and also kind of really tackle our own racism. I think this is, in a sense, not the full picture. One slogan is of these diaspora migrant communities in Europe or the West is, look, we are here because you were there, right? You were there in Africa, Asia, wherever, for centuries. And we have been in contact with each other. We have had a relationship. Our relationship, I mean, the Pakistani community or the Indian community in Britain, but also elsewhere in Europe, has every right to say, look, I mean, nothing new. We and our ancestors have been in a historical relationship with each other for centuries. So you don't need to tell me kind of like I am foreign, I am a stranger to you. No, you have known me and my ancestors and vice versa for centuries. So let's get real about this, and let's re-examine this history. So you, the Europeans, wake up. You need a more realistic kind of appreciation of your history. And this circle back to the problem of nationalism. Forget your national histories, rediscover your imperial histories. And we'll talk about that more probably later on, because this goes also for Switzerland. If you do this, then we can kind of really have a face-to-face, real conversations about our shared past in this imperial framework, which involved a lot of violence, a lot of inequalities. But once we acknowledge this common past that we have, only then can we then overcome the racism not only racism in terms of culture, but we talk a lot about structural racism, etc. and so forth, and try and overcome these forms of racism today and build better futures. So that was just to that. And then, but the question you asked was another one, which I have now meanwhile completely forgotten. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's more like a conversation. So I think you answered the first part, and the second part was more like, if it's not, the racism is not linked to the ability of being racist and to impose by force and by means, because we have it. And if any country was as powerful as the USA, then they will be also imperialist.
Right. And Switzerland, is being a small country, of course. I think that was one of your points.
But saying that, I realized that China could be, and
it is. Well, I mean, this is a discussion. I mean, now
but are not like it's not the same violent imperialist behavior than it is in the US. Maybe it's another form of imperialist, more economic.
I would also say
I don't know.
so.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, historically, then, of course, there are different kinds of imperialism. And we already talked about kind of the Ottoman Empire, which kind of had a completely different project or different vision, maybe more rooted also in Islam and religion than the European ones, which, of course, had this idea of enlightenment, etc. and so forth. I mean, there are different forms. And then, I mean, if you talk about China now, it was, of course, China doesn't conquer. I mean, China is extremely present, as we all know, throughout Asia, but also in Africa, for example. But China doesn't kind of enter Africa as the Europeans did, conquering them and building colonies. It's more, I mean, a term that is often used is like informal empire. So trying to influence other governments or territories through financial and economic power.
Can you speak about soft power?
Yeah, maybe soft power. Yeah, that's also, I mean, it is also a huge discussion. Can we talk of the US definitely a superpower, but was it also an empire? I mean, in certain senses, no, because, I mean, of course it was an internal empire. I mean, the US kind of established, I mean, itself through conquest, and also, I mean, let's be honest about this, the
slavery.
Well, first of all, yes, slavery, but then also, I mean, the kind of
genocide,
more or less genocide or marginalization or whatever term you want to use. So-called indigenous population there. I mean, the US or I mean the Americas were populated, so they kind of had to, or they had to. That's what they did. They got rid of these indigenous societies to establish their own internal empire, and of course, as you mentioned, then also slavery, exploiting the workforce of enslaved people from Africa was also part of the American nation-building project. And then, of course, the US, they exerted, and to this day, they exert a lot of power beyond their national borders. But as we all know, I mean, this is a different kind of imperialism, so they didn't kind of really conquer Chile or Argentina or these other Latin American countries. It's through other means that they then try to install governments or kind of, instigate coups, military dictatorships that would put in place government. But also, I mean, Iran is another example in all these places in the Middle East. So those are the means they use to kind of make sure that they put governments in place that would kind of respect the interests, the geopolitical and also economic interests and cultural, of course, visions of the United States. So there are kind of different forms of imperialism. And China, I think, is also doing something similar or less. So I think the interesting thing, I mean, what people talk, if you talk about China, the interesting thing is China is less interested at the moment, at least, in cultural imperialism. So they're not, as far as we know, they're not interested at all in turning, let's say, African societies into Chinese-speaking societies, or even adopting their version of communism, if it's still communism at all. They're not interested in that at all. It's mainly economic, financial, and geopolitical.
Yeah, because we have a lot of American music here in Switzerland, but not a lot of Chinese music.
Yeah, no, or at least not yet.
Not yet in our radio, at least. So there's different forms, yes. So let's go back to, because I've always seen imperialist as a point of view of a state, the imperialism of UK, the imperialism of Spain, Portugal.
Absolutely.
But I've never thought about imperialism as a European or as a, as a continent thing. So
that's a really important point. So I think this goes back then to the problem of nationalism that we have also in scientific or academic history writing. So I mean, to a large extent, I mean, the whole science of history was for a long time, and to this very day is nationalist in a sense that, we talk about the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese, etc., and so forth, and kind of implying, well, these empires were national empires, and we can distinguish them from another. And in one way, I mean, it's important to see, of course, that there is some truth to it. I mean, of course, there was extreme competition then between these empires, right? Always.
Yeah, France and Britain.
And particularly in the 19th century. And this, and of course, I mean, this then, of course, the catastrophe of the First World War was kind of the outcome of this extreme competition between national empires. But I think something that has been neglected, and that now in scholarship, I mean, we use the term now trans-imperial histories is one of the terms that is kind of being used more and more often. It's really to understand and appreciate the fact, well, all of those, and if we talk about these European empires, all of those empires were actually not that national. I mean, it's a real question, how British was the British Empire actually, if we ask, well, okay, where did, for example, the European soldiers come from? to help the British fight all these wars in Asia, in Africa, and elsewhere. Then we discover, okay, well, of course, there were a lot of British, there were some Scots, and some forced Irish who had to fight in these wars. But what about all these Germans? And then it becomes interesting for us. What about all these Swiss? Why are they there? And this is true for all empires. If you look at the French Empire in the 19th century, which started conquering, let's say, Algeria from the 1830s onwards, and we ask, well, okay, interesting. So how did you actually staff this colonial army? Where did your rank and file soldiers come from? And where did some of your leading officers come from? We discover all of a sudden, and this is interesting for us. Okay. Well, yeah, there were a lot of them were Swiss, because those were officers and soldiers that formerly, during the Ancien Regime, they were part of the regular Swiss battalions residing in Paris, who fought for the King of France. And then, of course, after these Napoleonic Wars and the revolutions, etc., and so forth, new French nation state they dissolved these Swiss troops. They didn't have any use for them anymore, which put in thousands of these Swiss soldiers who were employed formerly by the King of France and by the French authorities out of work. And so they were looking for new jobs. And where did they go? Well, one of the places that they could go is into this new army, or the Légion étrangère, as it then was called, to help the French then conquer Algeria, and later on went to Indochina. And so we can play this game for all empires. And I and my research, my colleagues in ETH Zurich, where I was before, we studied mostly or more intensively the Dutch case. And the Dutch case is a particularly interesting case because the Netherlands in many ways is similar to Switzerland. So in the 19th century, it's a rather small country with very limited national resources, right?
That's right.
Also a neutral country, also has this image of being like an inherently peaceful country. But they had, unlike the Swiss, they had this huge empire in Southeast Asia, which today is Indonesia, which is almost the size of Europe. So if you ask them, well, how on earth did the Dutch manage,
I actually wondered many times, and I was like, because like my wife is South African, and you have these Boer, culture there. And I was like, how could the Dutch have so much power and to like maintain order? No, not order, like the interest so far from the homeland. That was always a question.
Yeah, so that's a question. It started already in the early modern period. I mean, first of all, the Dutch Empire was built by this company, the Dutch East India Company, which is the largest kind of India company. It is often, sometimes we say it's just like the first multinational firm in the history of the world, because it was a company that established this Dutch Empire not only in Asia, but also, as you mentioned, in South Africa and also in parts of Brazil. And then if we look at, and this company employed during roughly 200 years of its existence 700,000 employees from Europe, and many more from outside of Europe, but those are only the Europeans.
Wow.
And then if you look, so how did the Dutch East India manage to find 700,000 employees? Yeah. Where did they come from? And this is great work that Dutch colleagues have been doing. We find that, they came from all over Europe, including, many of them from the German-speaking countries, and then, of course, many also from Switzerland. And this continues then into the 19th century, when the Dutch the Dutch government or the Dutch king takes over the empire and kind of establishes a new, modern colonial army. Of course, this army also then depends on massively, up to 40% of the soldiers, of European soldiers in the Dutch colonial army are non-Dutch Europeans. So the largest groups...
How many percent, sorry?
40%. So the large, in quantitative term, the largest kind of foreigner groups are, first of all, the Belgians, which is not surprising because Belgium was, until 1830, actually part of the Netherlands, and then it became its own nation state. There are a lot of kind of cultural and linguistic proximities. So there are lots of Belgians, and then the second largest groups are the Germans, which is a difficult term because Germany, we can talk about that later, is in the 19th century, not as we know it today. It was also, if you look at Prussia, for example, also in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And then, which just becomes interesting for us. So the third largest group, ex aequo, with the French, are the Swiss. So there are roughly 8,000 Swiss soldiers fighting in the Dutch colonial army in the 19th century, and it's the same number as the French. So I'm just making, so just to circle back, I mean, what does this mean analytically? This is really now changing our understanding of what empires are. So really forcing up to give up the idea that empires are like these national units in many different ways. All those empires were, if you want to say it like that, multinational. If you look at where the soldiers came from for the armies, if you look at where the capital investments came from, so also, I mean, here, which is important for us too, I mean, other historians have shown this, Switzerland's such a small territory with so many extremely wealthy grand famille, as we say here in Normandy, establishing themselves in the 17th and 18th century. For them, it was absolutely impossible to invest their wealth on these small territories to which they governed here, let's say Bern or even the city-state of Geneva, etc. and so forth. So they invested oftentimes also in the Dutch East India Company or in the British East India Company or in the Compagnie des Indes. So yeah, if you look at soldiers, capital, staff, but then also scientists, missionaries, engineers, architects, I mean, all these kinds of expertise and the knowledge and the resources and the manpower that is necessary to build an empire, every European empire recruited not only on its national territory, but throughout Europe. And so this is why we're speaking more and more of trans-imperial history in this European kind of perspective, appreciating the fact that, yeah, European imperialism was, of course, marked by competition. There's no denying that. But collaboration and working together was also just an equally important part of the story. And this then is important to understand. This then really helps us to understand, or then it becomes, yeah, almost, you know, not surprising at all. Through this, then we understand why Switzerland, quite naturally, if I may say so, of course, was also part not only of all empires. Switzerland integrated into all empires through its mercenaries, its capital investments, its scientists, its big missionary societies, was involved in more or less all of the European empires.
That was my question. Is it only individual behavior, contractual mercenaries, you know, oh, there is a proposition of work, like today, if I don't know, in France or Germany, I have a good position and I can apply, why not? Or was it also politically motivated? Is there like, because imperialism to me comes from an understanding that a state or an organization whatsoever wants to expand its power. And if it's only for work, then people, because they work as warriors or, you know, mercenaries, then is there a political implication for Switzerland?
Well, as always, it depends on how we define the terms. I mean, and I think it's useful if we define politics in a very kind of strict sense. So politics is something that is done by a state or by a government. Yes, and I mean in the case of Switzerland, then of course there is no kind of political agenda. I mean, it's the Swiss government. We never had like a colonial ministry or a colonial minister. Switzerland never had like this. Imperial policy. So, I mean, the Swiss government never really thought about how to expand its kind of
like the Dutch, for instance.
Over non-European territories and how to maintain its position in competition with other competing empires. So, in that sense, there is not much political motivation. But if then we expand our understanding of the term politics, I mean, in recent years, I mean, everything is political something. I mean, you know, thanks to, for example, the women's movement, we learned the private is political. So, I mean, politics is something not that is only done in governments or parliaments or ministries. Politics kind of enters all fields of life. So then, yeah, I mean, now I'm working, for example, on missionary societies here in Switzerland who were involved everywhere. And I think, in a certain sense, I'm starting to believe, I mean, they had an immensely political, their goal was political. So, but in a different way. So their goal, and I'm talking about the Protestant mission societies, So their goal was not, they were not interested in national politics. They didn't think in national terms. Their goal was not to expand the British or the Dutch or the French or any national empire. Their primary goal, their vision was to establish a Protestant empire. So to really carry Protestantism throughout the world, in Africa and Asia, or even in Latin America. And that's like a political goal that they had. And therefore, they had kind of like, it is a political project, and therefore then they kind of interacted, or they kind of collaborated. Then, if it was kind of helpful, of course, they were more than happy then to make use of the infrastructure in place by imperial governments, or also accept help from imperial governments, sometimes also from imperial armies, in order for them to achieve their goal, which was to proselytize and to try and make sure that as much of the non-European world as possible would eventually become Protestant.
And it worked. I mean, I'm always very surprised to witness in South Africa, because that's my example with my family, who are more dedicated Christian than the Christian that are here.
Yeah, that's very. So I'm also working on a region in southern Africa, let's say, which is today the small state of Lesotho, which is up in the northeast, right? Formerly it was called the Basuto land, and it's interesting what you're saying, because this is a good example actually. So I mean, in South Africa, then, of course, first were the Dutch, but then with the arrival of the British, I mean, the London Missionary Society was the most important and also politically most influential missionary society in South Africa then in the early 19th century. But as I mentioned before, so the London Missionary Society, of course, they were very kind of connected to the British imperial government. They also were very, very influential, but they thought in terms of Protestantism. So they were extremely interconnected with other Protestants on continental Europe. So they worked very closely together with the Rotterdam Mission Society, so the Dutch Mission Society, with Protestant mission societies in Germany, but also with the Basel Mission here in Switzerland, and particularly with what at the time was called these auxiliary societies here in Geneva, in the whole part of the Romandie. So small societies whose purpose was to do fundraising and try and finance the Protestant mission societies. Most of the funding from this part of Switzerland went to the Paris Evangelical Mission Society, but they also funded the Basel Mission and the Rotterdam Society, and etc. and so forth. So this is then in South Africa. The example is very kind of illustrative, because then, I mean, the London Mission Society was in place. They had privileged access to the British government, but of course they lacked the resources to go further up into the hinterland. So it was them. They actually then they kind of organized this. They actually then invited or asked their French Protestant brethren, as they would call them at the time, then, look, I mean, why don't you try and go up further north into this Basuto land? Because for them it is not a problem that the French Protestants or the Swiss French Protestants spoke German or French. They had this shared vision of of building this Protestant empire and work together.
There's a region in South Africa whose name is Franschhoek. And that was also the French society who was there in South Africa. So it seems that it kind of share the same goal. And I didn't realize that that's the Christian goal. That's crazy. Yeah. But then we started to say the reason behind imperialism is probably racism. And I'm sure it is, because all the violence, we are the best. We are the best, therefore we know better, and we know how to do good, therefore we're going to tell you what is good. But is there then a sane reason there? Like, I wish you're more healthy, genuine reason behind imperialist behavior, to wish the best for the bigger number. Does that exist, or is it really because we think we're best and we're going to submit you to
there are then different ways of kind of this white superiority or kind of European superiority, and it becomes then a bit complicated. But that's also then why maybe the missionaries are an interesting example, because the missionaries, of course, they were not like the let's say the army officers, or they were not like the the traders, the capitalists. I mean, they were quite critical of these. They were quite critical of the economic expansion of Europe, for example, because from their view, the economic expansion corrupts then the so-called indigenous societies. They would start to drink alcohol, and they would start to adopt all the vices that already, from their perspective, the modern European society was suffering from: alcoholism, poverty, non-Christian behavior. So they were very, very critical of that. So there were tensions. And in their discourse, I mean, the missionaries, they usually said, well, no, I mean, our interest, we really want to protect these so-called indigenous societies from the vices of these, of European culture, actually. And in the case of Lesotho and other cases, I mean, there were huge conflicts, namely between the missionaries and, for example, these Boer states, so these, descendants of the Dutch societies who kind of expanded up north, and who very, very violently conquered these territories of these African kingdoms. And the Protestant missions, they tried to protect their tribes, as they called them. So in a sense, I mean, also some historians have then also tried to argue, well, the missionaries were actually anti-imperial or even anti-colonial because they were against it. And this does capture something indeed. Also then the missions were, of course, involved in building hospitals, establishing schools, trying to reduce poverty, etc. and so forth. But I mean, then there's also a but, and this but is important. I mean, this was, of course, transactional. I mean, there's always, I mean, there is always the precondition: look, we will help you if and only if you give up your heathen ways and you convert to Christianism, so either Protestantism or Catholicism. That was kind of the hook. And in that way, we say, well, of course, I mean, these Protestant or Catholic missionaries, they were not anti-imperial, anti-colonial in that sense. They were also part of a larger project of Europeanizing in a particular way, kind of proselytizing, Christianizing, so kind of forcing and using also the crisis and the poverty, the negative effects of this European expansion in these regions, then saying, look, we can help you, but first you need to convert. So, of course, that in itself is, of course, also a very, very violent form of
and saying like
helping.
Yeah. Look, we can help you. Have they asked anything before we say that? Like,
sorry?
The look, we can help you. Does it come like like by our own, or did they, these nations and kingdoms, ask for help? I don't think they ever.
Sometimes they ask for this. Yeah, well, they did actually. But so this then it becomes. So then it becomes another. I mean, there's another very important conceptual shift now in the way we try and do global history. Let's say, I think one of the problems with the way history, also colonial history, was told, and is still told actually today. I mean, we are becoming aware. We need to talk more about also, let's say, the Swiss presence in the non-European world, and a lot of historians do this work. But in a certain way, their work remains Eurocentric or even Helvetocentric. So their analytical focus remains on these Swiss actors, and mostly they're men. So they examine the history from that perspective, and then even critically, I mean, a lot of critical historians, so they kind of try to denounce and criticize, let's say, economic colonial exploitation by Swiss traders, Swiss firms, Swiss missionaries, etc., and so forth. But I think more recently we are understanding. Look, we need to think in terms of relationships, okay? And of course, if these relationships, they're not equal, they're hierarchical. But in every relationships, there are different kind of degrees of power or of agency and of possibilities for resistance or subversion. So if we kind of examine it this way, then it is very, very important to see. I mean, these African societies, and particularly the African leaders, let's say, of these kingdoms and their governments and their diplomats, I mean, they were, of course, not naive. They knew exactly. I mean, they had a very, very concise analysis of what is going on, what their situation is. So they saw, look, I mean, this is this kind of overpowering European presence. We are getting under pressure. So what are our strategies? And one strategy, indeed, and this was the case for this the King Moshoeshoe in the so-called Basutoland, he actually then also invited the missionaries, because from his point of view, okay, they will try and proselytize my people, Christianize my people, but they also inviting these Protestant missionaries into my kingdom also can give me a sense, or can give me some security, because I know these French-speaking Protestant missionaries are in very, very close contact with the London Missionary Society, and through those channels they have privileged access to the British imperial government. So what he was trying to do is then use this diplomatically, particularly in these wars against the Boers that were coming up to his land, to kind of then use these channels to get the British colonial government to help him in the war against the Boers. I mean, that's simplified. That was his strategy. One of the reasons why he kind of invited these Protestant missionaries to kind of help him in this conflict. Of course, then it was a gamble. I mean, yeah. I mean, we're talking really about high imperialism here. I mean, the British did eventually then help him, but of course they didn't. They just then, turned then the Basutoland, or the Lesotho as it then was called, into a British kind of colony.
That's interesting, but that's still the reason for him asking was because of the consequences of imperialism first.
Yeah.
So he had to react to that.
Of course, yes. And his I mean, that's the story, I think, at large then of, I mean, Africa in the 19th century, and you have the autonomy of these realms, of these kingdoms is shrinking.
Yeah.
And so they're in crisis. But of course, they try to struggle and resist, and so of course they also make their own political and diplomatic and strategic calculations, and they try to use then also the conflicts or the tensions between these different European groups to their own advantage. That's so. Yeah. We really,
facing the reality.
If we tell the story, we need to also take the agency, the strategy, the thinking of
very important
the non-European counterparts.
Otherwise,
it has to be part of the narrative.
I understand your point. Otherwise, it's really only about us, and we forget them completely.
Yes,
and that's that's very Europe-centric, as you said. Can we go back to what exactly? You talk about the Swiss mercenaries joining armies and forces to impose or to expand. Does the Swiss has other responsibility or other action that they took in order to help European expansion or colonialism around the world?
Well, I see. I mean, not only me, me and a lot of colleagues, I mean, we're kind of rethinking Europe. So we think, I mean, there are these, clearly there are imperial centers, so-called metropoles, Paris and London, of course, in earlier history, Madrid and Lisbon, and etc. and so forth. And then there are, to different degrees, there's internal peripheries, And so classically, I think there is a very, very large kind of periphery of this German-speaking Europe. I mean, because if we remember, I mean, also Germany unified as a nation rather late in the 1870s, and also became an empire late. It's a late empire. Before that, for a long, long time, for centuries, this whole part of Europe, which included Switzerland, were these small miniature states. So I mean, in Switzerland, we had these cantons that were kind of loosely connected to each other through the Diet, the Tagsatzung. Then later on, it became this federal state, but the federal state is kind of established as a, kind of over 20 cantons trying to establish their a federal structure. And in large parts of Europe, what is today Germany and also Eastern Europe, it's the same, right? So you have these small, politically small states. And if you look at Northern Europe and part of Eastern Europe, it's actually the same. So I think Switzerland is part of these kind of inner European, let's say, peripheries with these small states who don't establish their own overseas empires or only late. But they are, in a sense, they are zones, they are resource and service zones. So what I mean by this is, typically in these zones, we have a surplus of population surplus, let's say, too many people in Switzerland, but also in Germany. So a lot of people from these territories, they migrate. So they are part and parcel of the colonization of the Americas. I mean, the German speakers, which includes what is today Germany, but goes until to the Baltic states, right? I mean, many German migrants, they go first to Russia, they end up close to St. Petersburg, and then they migrate to the United States. So large parts of these European colonizers in the Americas, they come from these German-speaking parts of Europe, including Switzerland. So this as colonizers, okay. Mercenaries is a second category we already talked about. And then, as I already mentioned, missionaries is another category. And then, later on it continues then, because in this part of Europe you have then already from very early on, you have a very high degree of education, very, very good research universities, and particularly in Germany, but also in Switzerland, etc. and so forth. So it is no surprise that many of the experts that are used to, let's say, explore these colonies, to do maps, but then also to kind of modernize, you need botanists, for example, to run plantations. You need engineers to build, bridges, infrastructure, and so forth. They also all come from these territories, including Switzerland. So the reason I'm stressing this is there's no Swiss particularity. I think Switzerland is in many ways part of these larger inner European peripheries, resource and service zones. What distinguishes then Switzerland from Germany later on, then in the late 19th century, then with German unification, then Germany becomes its own empire and Switzerland kind of remains. It remains this kind of resource and service zones. But your question was, I mean, how did the Swiss help build empires? And this then, the question that you are asking is, I mean, what was the intention of these mercenaries, these scientists, these missionaries to go abroad? Was it their primary intention? Oh, we want to go there because we are so fan of the Dutch, we are so fan of the French, we want to help our French friends establish their empire. If you look at it closely, no, it's more complicated than that. I mean, now if we talk about imperialism, oftentimes we talk about imperial formations, which means an empire is kind of built up of multiple different projects, which oftentimes stand in tension to each other. So people can be many things. People can be Swiss, but at the same time, they are, for example, scientists. So the primary motivation to go abroad, to go into some so-called unexplored, unknown colony somewhere, is not necessarily to advance any Swiss geopolitical interests. No, it is. But it's neither. The primary intention is neither to help, let's say, the Dutch kind of expand their empire in Southeast Asia. No, they are, like we are today, they are primarily scientists. So they want to make a scientific career. They go there because they want to impress the leading scientists of their day, which are maybe in Berlin, in London, or elsewhere. So they want to do good science. That's their primary motivation. But of course, even if that is their motivation, the implications of them going there, the implications of their work, also the consequences of some of their work, of course, then can have very dramatic political effects. This is the work I did for my PhD thesis, which looked at the story of two cousins from Basel who explored parts of the Dutch Empire, and thereby then, although it is not their primary intention, provided the Dutch then with the necessary maps and knowledge to later on then actually violently conquer and colonize this island of which is today Sulawesi. Which before the Swiss, the Saracens from Basel went there, this island was still largely ruled by autonomous so-called indigenous kingdoms.
Can we add another actor, which would be the transnational corporation?
Yes.
Would that be also like, because you have Nestle, for instance, that's an example amongst others.
Yes.
You have the banks.
Yeah.
Are they also tools for imperialist behavior, concerted, or do you see more like as a the capitalism is generally imperialistic.
I think, there's good studies done here in Switzerland about, Switzerland is then also in the 19th century a country with remarkable, some of the largest trading firms are actually in Switzerland. One example that's been looked up by Christoph de Jong, University of Bern, is the Volkart brothers in Winterthur, which really in the 19th century they grow into, I think, the third or fourth largest international trading firm worldwide. So I would say this, the same thing, the primary motivation of these Volkarts from Winterthur is not to expand British imperial power in India or elsewhere. They were present in Latin America, in Africa, everywhere. Yeah, they were traders, capitalists, right? So they tried to make a profit. But in doing so, of course, first of all, they benefited, of course, from the infrastructure that was in place, and also, of course, from the violence, the submission of these societies, which then enabled Europeans to build huge plantations and produce cotton, for example, which then the Volkart brothers could trade. So they benefited, of course, from this. And I then would also say these European multinational firms, they then, of course, also, one of the effects is they build what we call now world markets, a global economy, which, of course, is organized in such a way that it benefits primarily the interests of the so-called First World or the West, so Europe and the United States. The way the infrastructure is set up, the way, if we look at, the international community, you need investments. So where are the major banks situated? It's, of course, no coincidence that the most important banks in the world, they're not situated in, let's say, Senegal or Botswana or Uruguay or Paraguay or anything like that. No, they're situated here in Europe or in the United States, including Switzerland, UBS, and CS, etc. and so forth. So I would say, the consequence of this is of these multinational firms that kind of establish themselves in the imperial 19th century, and their primary motivation is not necessarily to expand national imperial interests, but they build this world economy that, again, connects different imperial territories and integrates these different empires into a world market, which enables them, us to to enables Volkart to buy coffee in Brazil, and then if they find buyers, then they export it to Japan. That's the world economy. This world economy, of course, then that exists today, then comes out of this imperial context, is built by these, not only European, there are also some Asian, one has to add here, but by and large, I would say, they build the structures and the infrastructure of this world economy, which is not, let's say, neutral, but carries kind of the legacies of this, of the interest of the former imperial powers.
I'd like really to come back to the ethnocentric perspective. And obviously, I'm talking from a Western-centric views. But I realized lately, also during the conflict in Ukraine, that we here talk about the international community is condemning, this war. But when you look closer, it's only 1/3 of humanity in per capita. So what is the international community? Then we think we are. So from that perspective, my question is how imperialism and colonialism are perceived by what we call second world, or emergent world or developing world. Is it perceived how?
So I'm not really, as you know, I'm a specialist of the 19th century, so I'm not that qualified to talk about international politics today. But what I will say this, who is the international society? Then if you look at, international society is organized in so-called international organizations. And if we look then, I mean, the UN is a prime example. I mean, of course, I mean, on paper, every nation has one vote. So it's kind of every nation has the same weight, the same rights. But of course, we all know that's not true. In the Security Council, of course, the former, again, it's no coincidence that, I mean, if you look at the powers who are represented there, so it is kind of also the international, I mean, the UN, for example, of course, is still dominated by the former European, but also then now new powers like China, etc., and so forth. How is it then perceived? I mean, yeah, that's, you'd have to talk about to a specialist. I mean, I just come from a long, I come back from a long trip through Peru, which is a so-called country from the global south, and from Brazil. And it's complicated. I mean, but I mean, my understanding, and not being a specialist, but then that's more now talking maybe as a citoyen, I mean, just as a participant in the contemporary world, of course, in my historical education and what I observe and from the discussions I had. If you look at Peru, I mean, you have these astonishing legacies of imperialism. And I mean, the role of Peru since, you know, Spanish conquest, and actually to this day, the primary role of Peru is to export raw materials to the so-called global north. We have these huge mining firms in the, you know, in the mountains, in the Andes. That's the primary role. And in order to do that, of course, you need a government that kind of establish itself, or kind of also provides the infrastructure and makes sure that these mining firms are welcomed and they find everything they need. And this, of course, goes hand in hand, then, of course, with exploitation then of the namely the so-called indigenous population, let's say, in these territories. Now, I mean, it's still going on. There are huge protests going on from parts of the highlands and southern Peru, namely from these indigenous populations who are protesting their own government, right? So what I would say is, I mean, who is the international? It depends then. I mean, in many of these southern countries, one of the problems is then, I mean, there's a huge pressure, let's say, from the north to establish governments who would be willing to respect the economic and geopolitical interests of the more powerful countries from the north, but also then now new powers coming up like China, right? And this is a balancing act, because in doing so, they, of course, there's also then, the interests of the population at large, right? Who then kind of have different interests and would like to have a government in place that primarily serves maybe the interests of their own people. And I think it's a balancing act. So if you ask, well, how is the international community perceived? I mean, if you're talking about now governments and how these governments in the global south, they make their own political analysis and calculations, and it's also geopolitical. I mean, we know that India, of course, for example, is very, very critical, of course, the aid against Ukraine, and tries to steer its own course. But does the Indian government represent the whole of India, or does it only represent a particular kind of very right-wing conservative elite at the moment? It becomes then difficult, and then goes way beyond my expertise as a historian of the 19th century.
But we can go back to the 19th century. My question was, thank you for your answer, but my question was relation north-south. How was perceived these, what we describe as imperialist behavior on the local population? How did they see it, deal with it? That was more the question.
Yeah.
You know,
but it's a huge question, of course. It's a huge question. I
mean, to try to get out of the we are the bad people, which we were, the violent, oppressor. I have no doubt about that. But in a perspective to try to see from a different point of view, my question is, you've studied that. How did they perceive and manage to go through this violent time for them as oppressed people most of the time, but not only, maybe? That's the question.
This is, of course, a gigantic question. We have to look at cases.
That's right.
I mean, in general, I think it's important to stress, I mean, the history of, let's say, European expansion is always also a history of resistance to this violent European expansion. I mean, if we talk about slavery, I mean, there is not one single person among these approximately 12 million people from Africa that were forcefully, carried across the Atlantic to put to work if they survived on European land plantations. Nobody did this voluntarily. It is always
story of resistance.
Yes. But oftentimes in smallest. And then the question is, well, what are the possibilities for resistance, right? So, yeah, in this instance, if you talk about slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, or if you talk about other kind of colonial situations, sometimes the European power and violence was so extreme that, resistance was almost not possible. But even there, if you look at it then from the micro perspective, we do discover, a lot of research has been done. This is a classic theme then in the history of slavery, for example. Then if you look at and this is a real problem then for the European plantation owners. I mean, of course, also the enslaved population on plantations, they used any kind of opportunity they had to resist. And this could be small things. I mean, just work as slow as possible. I mean, we know that it is extremely inefficient because they would kind of. There are interesting sources. I mean, these European and some of them were also Swiss kind of plantation owners. Also here from, there was a guy from the canton de Vaud, which we are in now. His name was Guizon, and he became like
the military.
Well, the general is the same family. The Swiss general is the Second World War, but I'm talking about the guy. This is late 18th century.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
He became the chief engineer of the King of France for the slave colony in French Guinea. He kind of, his job was to modernize this slave colony for the King of France. And so he wrote then kind of like an analysis or like a handbook on how to modernize slave plantations. And this is a very, very interesting source because then he talks about also how, it's like a management handbook. So how can you efficiently manage a labor population
oppressed and
that is, yes. So how do you do this? And then he talks he gives these kind of like tips. Well, look, I mean, he has this idealistic vision. Let's try and use as little violence and force as possible. Not necessarily out of humanistic reasons.
No, he was like.
But it's unclear. It's unclear.
For practical reason. No?
Yes. It's not efficient. If you kind of whip, it's not efficient.
But that's the same rules apply today for human resources processes. We're like, we understand that if we're too bossy, then people are not motivated. We need to make them feel motivated by themselves.
Yes, exactly.
So probably the same.
Yeah, but it's
thinking.
I mean, he was also enlightenment. I mean, it can be both. It's not mutually exclusive.
I
understand. You can have touched. I mean, you can recognize the human in the slave, while at the same time, your position is you are kind of have to perform this function for the French king. So it's messy. But anyway, what he gives this. This is an interesting source because it shows then the multiple ways in which enslaved people could resist or at least could subvert. So he would also talk about that. Look, if you are a small, middle manager on a plantation, it's very, very important for you to realize that the enslaved population, they're always observing everything you do. Mm-hmm. And you have to be consistent in the way you treat them. You cannot say this on one day and another thing on the next day. Because as soon as the enslaved population will notice that you are not consistent, that you are contradicting yourself, they will use this against you, right? So it's a very interesting way, a very interesting source that talks about the multiple ways in which the enslaved population is kind of constantly observing, let's say, their masters, and whenever they find an entry to resist, they will use it.
Rightly.
And the ambivalence of this source is then he kind of gives us insight into these strategies of the enslaved population, but at the same time, and that's your point, and this is the reason why oftentimes we talk as colonies or plantations as so-called laboratories of modernity, because you're absolutely right. It's in these, those at the time, plantations, it is a real management challenge.
Yes.
Because you had to manage hundreds and hundreds of people enslaved to efficiently produce this product. So it was like also a management handbook. So they would develop management skills. They would, like Guizot, he would theorize this management handbook, and this knowledge then, of course, became also extremely sought after then in the 19th century during industrialization here in Europe. When in Europe then you established factories where you had a workforce, you had to manage several hundred people. People, they were not enslaved, but they were nevertheless exploited. So you can see then also this was what we call the circulation of knowledge. So managerial skills and strategy that Europeans learn on the plantations then circulate back here in Europe and find use then, okay, well, how can I manage a factory in the canton of Glarus, for example, or elsewhere in Europe?
Engineering of slavery, I would call that. I don't know why it comes to my mind. Very interesting. And we rarely portrayed it that way, like when we talk about the problem of imperialism, we talk about how bad we were, not how the other side was trying to deal with it. And this resistance, we don't speak a lot about resistance of others.
Well, we here don't, but then, this is then has to do with power. I mean, in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia, I mean, the memory of exploitation, but also the memory of resistance is very alive. Then it is, of course, then also used and kind of exploited. I mean, with decolonization, the establishment of new independent nation states in Africa or in Asia and elsewhere, of course. I mean, as we here in Europe, or also the canton of Vaud. I mean, the canton of Vaud also has its hero, like its liberation hero. What is his name? Davel. The liberator of the canton of Vaud against the Bernese colonizers, let's say. Yeah, in Africa and Asia, it's the same thing. So there also then there are, of course, there's a certain kind of heroes. Every country has its heroes of anti-imperial resistance. So there, of course, the story is told completely different than it is here. And I think now, I mean, of course, here and there it's becoming more and more, as you said at the beginning of this conversation,
intertwined.
Yes, so this is also then, I think, one of the consequences is this, that we're trying also to tell new stories, so to show the agency not only of the Europeans and European oppressors, but also then to pluralize. I mean, there are then huge differences between, let's say, a capitalist here in, let's say, Neuchâtel, who does his home office here in Neuchâtel and owns a plantation on Dutch Suriname and employs some, middle-level Swiss or French managers to manage the slaves there, the enslaved population themselves. So we're trying to tell stories kind of which captures the different positions and also perspectives in these stories, in these connected histories that were brought about through imperialism.
Smaller pictures in order to have a bigger picture. So you're now leading, if I understand well, a group of research that is has as an objective to rewrite the Swiss history. Can you tell a little bit more about that? How you do? What's the goal?
Yeah, I mean, so it tries to do some of the things, or many of the things that we have already talked about. But I mean, I think the problem of Swiss history, and this is also the problem of European history at large, I think one of the main problems is it always starts here in Switzerland or in Europe. So one of the main ideas of this project is, let's forget about Switzerland and Europe for a second. Let's start the story not here in the, let's say, in the federal archives or in the cantonal archives of Vaud. Let's try and start the story and then we have three kind of sub-projects, one in Brazil, one in Lesotho, Southern Africa, and one in India. So let's start, because there you had like this huge, massive presence of Swiss traders or missionaries, and that had a huge impact there. So let's not start the story here, let's start there.
Yeah, great.
Secondly then, and so territory, okay. How does looking at Brazil or these non-European territories shed new light on Swiss and European history? Secondly, and related to that then, let's, if possible, and this is then a challenge, let's, if possible, not start the story with a Swiss plantation owner in Brazil, or with a Swiss missionary in Lesotho, or a Basel missionary in India. Let's try and start the story, if possible, from some of the enslaved population on a plantation in Brazil, in Bahia, that was owned by Swiss, or with some of those so-called converts, indigenous African converts, who were kind of Christianized by these Swiss missionaries. I said, and in Basel, the same thing. And then related to that, then of course, this also necessitates that we kind of rethink the archives that we use. So what we're trying to do is, well, let's not, first of all, go here to the Swiss Federal Archives or to some colonial archives in London, Paris, or The Hague. Let's try and start looking at these regional and local archives in Bahia, in Lesotho, or in India. Let's try and start the story there. And this is what we call a global and collaborative history of Switzerland, because in order to do that, of course, we need to work together with colleagues. I mean, for example, now I am working on the project of Lesotho, Southern Africa. There we have a wonderful source which almost no historians, no European historians, no colonial historians have looked at. From the 1860s onwards, there's this... It was a guy from here, Adolphe Mabille, from the canton of Vaud. He was one of the big missionaries in the region. He launched this newspaper in the Sesotho language. So this is a very, very ambivalent source. So it was the missionaries that kind of invented a grammatical structure of this language in order to write it. But what is interesting for us, in fact, it's an interesting source then, more and more we see then not only the missionaries writing and trying to proselytize using this local Sesotho language. We see then more and more African so-called catechists or converts who were sent out to the hinterland in some small villages to proselytize. They then start sending back letters that get published in this newspaper in the Sesotho language. So I, of course, I don't speak Sesotho, I don't read it, right? Very, very few European historians do. So there I am collaborating with an absolutely fantastic colleague. She is a historian, an artist, Dineo Sejoete, who actually also comes from one of those convert families whose family history is, of course, very, very closely implicated in the presence of these Swiss missionaries there. And she is one of the most, I would say, interesting historians from that region in her own way. And so I'm working together with her. So she's translating, and then we are trying to discuss these translations. But she doesn't only make these translations available, she then also translating is then also interpreting. So the way we're trying to tell the story is then, also discussing, look, from looking at this source or your translation here from my perspective as a Swiss historian, I see this and this and this. But this is not necessarily what people, my colleague Dineo finds particularly interested, because she has, of course, a completely different background than I have. So this is the collaborative aspect of it. So we try and find interpretations that can kind of bridge the questions that we have here in Europe with some of the questions that are maybe there prevalent in South Africa. And it's also an experiment. We're at the very beginning of this process, so it's an open question. Will we find in all these three sub-projects, will we find a consensus? Will we develop kind of like a consensual interpretation of this connected history of Switzerland? Or is it the case that, depending on who and in which region people are socialized and the questions they have, that maybe, we will have completely different interpretations of this history.
That sounds like a very interesting project you're in.
Oh, thanks.
I'm looking forward to know more about when this study goes further. We evoked that a little bit earlier, the racism, and I think you've studied the history of racism as well. A bit. Yes. So also because I'm linking to today, we are questioning racism a lot. With the wokeism movement is all about structural racism and alienation of oppressed and so on. What I don't see in this critique, is the or what we discussed, the imperialist behavior of the West. In USA, they don't really talk about it. Doesn't seem they don't talk about politics, and I don't understand. They accuse one another of naming people wrongly. But to me, if I don't understand why then they don't follow up the critique and go further or deeper.
And then, can you give a concrete example? I'm not sure I fully understand
Yeah,
what you're getting at.
I see the argument online, but you know, it may be reductive because what's online is most of the time superficial.
Yeah.
But then we argue mostly because, but it's not only racism, it's only sexism, you know, the pronouns story and gender and stuff.
Okay.
But it seems to be like a hierarchy of the most oppressed. The most oppressed would be the woman, the black woman with kids of a foreign country and stuff.
Yes.
But then it seems to me that we argue on detail, but not on the big pictures of, you know, the problem of power and the West, the North versus the South. So I was wondering if you have some hints, because you studied the history of racism, and what do you make of this new wokeism perception of it? I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah. I think I think I understand what you mean, but it's also a big question. But I would also say, I'm not the only one to say it. Because you used the term woke or wokeism, and I'm not a specialist of this, but I would also, I also belong to those who would say, the way the term is used now, it's a term that is used primarily by, let's say, the right conservative kind of movement. Well, there might be different. So this is an interesting thing. I am most familiar I know the discourse in the German-speaking part of the world and in the English-speaking. It might be different here in the French-speaking part of the world. Because, wokeism is kind of like, in the German-speaking part of the world, and I think also in the US, with the Republicans, etc. and so forth, it's kind of the argument is, look, all this is completely exaggerated, right? So we have now, radicalized students on university campuses and anti-racial activists on the streets who are trying to police our speech and trying to take away our liberties of freedom of expression. We're not allowed to talk anymore the way we used to talk. And it's completely exaggerated. And this is a real threat to open society and democracy. That's the way I perceive the term wokeism, how it is used by right conservative
I see.
Actors.
I don't perceive the wokeism as a threat. In the opposite, I perceive wokeism as try to wake up because we're fucking up. So it's more like that.
Yeah.
So I see that as a good thing to start with, people like rethinking concept and so you may be right. It may be used by the left wing, but I to me it's not negative to start with.
Okay.
What we do with it,
yes,
that's my question.
I think we have now a reaction.
Seems to me to be a bit superficial in the discourse, but I'm very ignorant, so I was just trying to start it.
Some of the discussions that we're having here also in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, more maybe than here in the Romandie, I don't know. There is a lot of critique then on, let's say, symbols, right? So-called symbolic racism. So in German-speaking, I've just co-authored with a colleague a report for the city of Zurich, and the report is on what in German is the word, I'm going to pronounce it in German, it's called the Moor. So the Moor is a term that is used, a racist term is used to designate people of African descent. And one of the problems in Zurich and also in other Swiss cities and throughout Europe is that we have a lot of these symbols in the old town of Zurich. So in Zurich there are several houses that kind of have like images or that depict supposedly there are European fantasies, but I think they try to depict African people in clearly racist ways.
Would that be like the N-word?
So it's kind of like it's in close relation to the N-word. So anyway, of course, anti-racist groups rightly have been critiquing. I mean, this is just one example, but they're also critiquing other things like, the Rhodes statue in the UK and also the names of Rhodes carrying the names of former, imperialists and slave owners, etc. and so forth. Yes. So, and I think they ask for we need to, we need to change this. I mean, their argument is say, look, the public space that we share, that we live in, still, carries in so many ways symbols and oftentimes celebrates kind of people like Rhodes who, were extreme racists, for example, that carry symbols from the colonial period. Also, children's books kind of tell stories from the colonial period. And I mean, in the German-speaking part of Europe, we just a carnival, Fastnacht. So a lot of costumes, kids, or also grown-ups dressing up as so-called Red Indians or dressing up, with trying to as Africans, etc. and so forth. So a lot of these anti-racist movements, are I think rightly criticizing this.
I think so too.
So, and this then is course, and then I think we have this right conservative reaction to this. So this then is often then called wokeism in for example in Zurich it's the NZZ, for example, who kind of is one of the outlets that kind of and tries to push forward this argument. Look, this is all harmless. It's totally exaggerated. From a historian, as a historian, then of course I'm often asked, well, what do you think? Because you're a colonial historian and you're a historian of racism. So I would then also say, well, look, I mean, you need to really listen very, very carefully to this critique. I mean, none of these anti-racist activists ever said, look, the only problem with racism that we have are these statues or these street names or these children's books. But given the legacy, or what they then rightly call structural racism, is we have also the problem of a extreme, and particularly in Switzerland, underrepresentation of, let's say, people of color, black people, or people of indigenous descent in the regular power structures. So we don't have many people sitting in parliament, or nobody. We don't have any people sitting in cantonal governments or in city councils or in leading positions in the administration. So what do you expect us to do? I mean, if we would sit in parliament or in the city council, of course, then we would have the means to change also stuff that is troubling. Heard, for example, we have also a huge problem in Europe, but also in Switzerland, with so-called racial profiling. But because we are not in the positions to influence these decisions. Of course, what we need to do, our strategy, and it's not a new strategy, there's always a strategy of minorities, is to appeal to the public space. So then to seek a conversation through talking about public symbols to get a conversation going. But it's not, of course, not the end of the fight or the struggle against racism is getting rid of these statues or taking some of this racist imagery out of children's book. This is the beginning then, in order to kind of raise awareness. If then there is an awareness, okay, we have this legacy also in our culture and in the language that we use of this racism. If we kind of can start talking about this in the public discourse, people take us seriously, then we have a certain kind of foundation, the precondition to think then, okay, so if we agree on this now, how can we then re-examine some of the practices and structures in our governments, in our multinational companies, to make sure that then this kind of culture, which is then translated into practices and into structures in institutions, can change. Yeah. I mean, that's basically the way I see it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So step by step, that could explain my misunderstanding, because, and I agree with the Vulcans. I would say, we need to re-question and we need to change the structure of power. But then, if you go to today's problematic, which come from the history you were describing, what I see is the West hatred towards the rest of the world, and that's we see how Russophobia, for instance, also the Chinese are depicted as it's very racist against Chinese, and I don't see the same people who advocate for wokeism. I think it's positive. Advocating for that or against that.
Against what? Against anti-Chinese stereotyping,
or
for example.
or Russian, for instance.
Anti-Russian stereotyping.
Okay. For instance, I don't like the anti-war movement in USA is non-existent. It does not exist. Like if we look like the Vietnam War, you had like a movement that were resisting the war and the racism towards the Vietnamese. You don't see that towards the Russian.
But now we're really getting into political territory, if I understand you correctly. We're talking. We have this discussion also here in Switzerland. There was just read an interesting article this morning about Alain Berset.
Yeah.
Because he also, I think, he made a similar argument that you're trying to make, kind of regretting that there is like this. I think the word he used in German was Kriegslust. There's like people.
My argument here is that, to me, it feels like either you completely fighting the racist ideology, imperialist ideology, or you are using it for your own interest, and therefore you don't change the thing. And that's what seems to be, to me, some powerful people like Joe Biden, for instance, invoking the same, he's agreeing with a lot of the woke people, but still do very imperial and racist stuff in the same time. So against the Russian, the rest, the Chinese, the global world, I would say.
But I don't know if I understand you correctly, but so the Biden administration, as far as I know, they are critiquing, and in my, of course, rightly so. It's not the Russians per se, but the sitting dictator, Putin, and they are, of course, also trying to make sure that some of the rich Russian oligarchs who also reside in the US, that they try to confiscate their wealth, etc., and so forth. So, in my view, but I'm not following it that closely. I must admit, I don't see much like they're kind of scapegoating the Russians in kind of an
the Chinese. Maybe it's better example, because to them, USA has no interest in Ukraine or Russia, that's for sure. But indeed, we enter political discussion. So
the Chinese example is an interesting example because, they
are threatening Chinese every day.
Yeah, you're right. There's a long history, of course, of racism towards the Chinese, and also then maybe to some extent also Russians. Orientalism and the whole East for Western Europe is always problematic. They're always never really clear, are they Europeans or not? I would agree there. From a historical point of view, there's a long legacy of these orientalizing, exoticizing, or racist stereotyping of people from the so-called East, including on Russian territory, and particularly the Chinese. And of course, this is like a cultural archive, and this is still present today. So also then in the conflict that we are in today, of course, it is quite possible, or probably is the case, that many of these kind of stereotypes are then used now to deal with the situation at hand now. But in the Chinese case, what I find interesting is, from a Chinese point of view, China is much more powerful now than, let's say, the European Union. So, I don't know. In a way, it's kind of almost laughable. If there is European racism towards Chinese, it's almost ridiculous because, it's Europe that doesn't realize that, the balance of power has completely shifted. It's nowadays the Chinese who kind of have not only the economic and political means, but also the cultural means to kind of actually influence the way in which China is depicted here also in Europe, in the US. Some time ago, there's this very interesting article in the New York Times that kind of really explained how Chinese financial power and the given the enormity of the Chinese market, which is extremely important, for example, also for Hollywood, right? They need to also translate or sell their films in China. And also kind of for these productions, they are also sometimes dependent on capital investments from Chinese investors. So how China is now using this power that they have to influence the way in which Hollywood produces films and depicts China.
Yeah.
And this article then gave some few examples. I don't remember them anymore. But for a long time, of course, when China was still, let's say, a second world or even third-rate country, in many of these films, the villains, they were Russians or Germans or Chinese.
Or Chinese, yeah.
That has completely, or Asians, but that has completely changed now. And this is one result in which the Chinese and their power reaches even into the studios of Hollywood.
They could stop the propaganda.
Yes. So in that sense, I mean, the power, the balance of power has extremely shifted, and it's important for you speaking about waking up. Also, then I would say so. Also, I mean, it's important to have this anti-racist critique and kind of talk about the legacies of imperialism. But we also need to think. I mean, Europe or the West is not the center of the world anymore. It is kind of we are moving probably toward a sinocentrical world. So we kind of also have to kind of reevaluate. I mean, our position here in the world towards these new powers that are rising.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot, indeed. Other consideration on the relation North-South that you said you studied a little bit, or is there something we need to add to understand relationship between?
I mean, maybe it's coming back to one of the things. I mean, what I would say then. I mean, I think every, let's say, political struggle, and this is not the North-South, or let's say the struggle against racism is nothing new. I mean, you can start with. I mean, here in Europe, you can start in the medieval ages. I mean, you know, the peasants' uprisings, for example, here. Every kind of struggle against oppression kind of also plays out in the public sphere or in the cultural sphere, you know. And it's also a struggle about, who controls the discourse, who controls how we talk about the world. And this struggle out in the public sphere, of course, to some degree always, and I would say since the peasant uprisings that we hear, also, you know, the revolutionary struggles in the 18th century, the bourgeois revolutions, etc. and so forth. To have this struggle out in the public discourse, you have to simplify. And what happens if you simplify is you dichotomize. I think this is what you were getting at. There I would agree, of course. I mean, if you are struggling in the sphere of public discourse, I mean, you cannot, like we are doing here, you know, have a 2-hour discourse nobody will listen to. So you need to simplify, and oftentimes is dichotomizing. But still, there I would say, I mean, if you listen more closely, I think, I mean, many of these activists or scholars, I mean, it's not that dichotomous, because I think, I mean, in my observation, but your observation might be different. We have seen many kind of movements in the last few years. So we have seen the women's movement. I mean, huge protest demonstrations, you know, tens of thousands or more women on the street here fighting against patriarchy, sexism, etc. and so forth. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, but you also have the climate change, youth movement, etc. and so forth. But if you observe these people, these activists, I mean, if you listen to them carefully, I mean, I think they're often perceived in kind of like a dichotomous wise. It's us versus you. Yeah. But I think if you listen more closely, I mean, they are looking about, they are very, very well aware. I mean, that the kind of the technical concept that they use, it's also become part of the public discourse now, is intersectionality. Yeah. So how race, class and gender and these other kind of categories intersect. So I do think that many of these activists, they are actually thinking in nuanced and really differentiated ways. So the way then that their demands and their discourse then is kind of translated that's by the media, then I think that is there, it becomes then dichotomized again, right? You're right. That's one thing that I see. And the other thing that I see then, and I'm talking here again, of course, as an academic, privileged academic historian, I mean, given, and this kind of maybe comes back into the beginning of our conversation, given this long legacy also of academic history writing, kind of which was extremely nationalist and Eurocentric, I mean, we have kind of our knowledge about our global common history is still very, very limited, right? So I think there is also a lot of work to do then to show how, yeah, of course, imperialism or this European expansion was about power. And if you look at the longue durée, I mean, there's no denial that by and large, there were the Western European societies that benefited from this story much more than societies in particularly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, although there are differences there. But it's important to understand, I mean, these were systems then, and that kind of, then we have to really look at, okay, there are like then different kind of actor categories on all sides, on European sides and on the non-European sides. So of course you have a history of clearly oppression and victims, so to speak. But then also within Europe, I mean, if I just make one example, I did this research on mercenaries from Switzerland. I mean, of course, these mercenaries, they were tools of empire, so they committed atrocities and violence. But at the same time, many of them were also victims themselves because they came from the impoverished parts of these societies here in Switzerland or in Germany and elsewhere. Didn't have many opportunities, and one opportunity for them was to enlist in the Dutch colonial army or in the French Foreign Legion. And for a long time, until the second half of the 19th century, I mean, many of them died in these tropical war zones, not even on the battlefield, but just from the diseases, right? Or even in battle, then they died or got wounded. So they were kind of like used, they were the instruments. So they were not the ones who benefited mostly from this.
Never in war. The
exactly.
fighters never benefited.
And of course, all of those people, they had mothers, sisters, some of them also had wives here or kids. So then if you look at this perspective, okay, what does it mean for impoverished family from the rural parts of the Jura? Then their main breadwinner, he kind of, struggles, so he decides to go to the French Foreign Legion, hoping that there he might make a small fortune, come back, but in fact he then dies, and his family is then left here and then they're totally impoverished. So in what way does this family in the Jura then benefit from this French, let's say, colonial expansion in Algeria? So then it becomes complicated, right? And I think this is kind of work that, for such a long time, academic historians have completely neglected. So this is something that needs to be done to show how then it is a connected history. There is a clear hierarchy and violence, but we need to kind of then tell stories which can kind of show how different people on different part of this relationship kind of participated, sometimes also benefited, but oftentimes also became victims of this relational history.
Thank you for that nuanced. How do you get to inform yourself? That's a question that we ask all the guests here, because most of the guests who come here clearly have thoughts and worked on stuff, but how does information get to you? How do you harvest yourself information? What source are for you interesting and rich, maybe other that you would avoid?
What kind of information are you talking about?
Do you read newspaper? Do you look at studies? Do you go research yourself? Do you hear people? Do you use social network? What media do you use to get informed?
All of it. Well, I mean, of course, all of it. But of course, then there is a but. I mean, as an academic, of course, I mean, I'm privileged, and as all academics, I read scientific articles, books, etc., and so forth, go to conferences, follow conferences, etc., and so forth, right? So that's kind of, I'm part, and I use and I benefit from these scientific kind of, publications that are around. As a citoyen, not only of Switzerland, but of the world in the present tense, of course, I mean, like many, I read newspapers and consume media. I mean, I'm a big fan of the New York Times, so I have an abonnement of the New York Times. I mean, I mean, the New York Times always for big crisis. I always first turn to the New York Times, and then of course I have also several. I mean, the Swiss weekly newspaper in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, Die Wochenzeitung, which I think is an extremely good newspaper. I read that regularly, and then some dailies. But of course, yeah. Then I guess I'm like everybody else. I'm on social media, and then I have a lot of. I try to follow a lot of other fellow academics, or let's say public intellectuals, or activists, or politicians who post interesting stuff, and then of course I also read that. Which of course then, but of course this is then also, I mean, as always, it is biased, and I'm speaking maybe here also then as a Swiss German who has recently started to work here in Lausanne, which really made me aware of what we call the Röstigraben in Switzerland. So I must also admit, I mean, I try to read more Le Temps, try to really listen to Le Courrier, or listen to shows on RTS, etc. and so forth. But this made me then realize, of course, the way that I consume media is also structured through, I mean, it is a perspective, Anglophone perspective from the so-called global north. I mean, we talk about the New York Times, and German kind of structured perspective.
You have been a journalist, freelance journalist yourself for a while.
Mm-hmm. But a long time ago.
Yeah. Why and where?
Well, that was during my studies at the University of Bern. I worked for the newspaper Der Bund, which now merged with the Berner Zeitung. Anyways, part of this TA Media Tagesanzeiger empire. Wow. That's I worked there.
Another empire.
Well, it's it's media. They bought up all these titles. I mean, they control.
We need to be warrior of empires.
They control, the newspapers in Basel, in Bern, in Lucerne, everywhere. So anyway, at the time it was still independent, so I worked for this Der Bund newspaper.
So I like you interested because it seems to be a genuine quest for you to get information as an historian or researcher or journalist. What drives you to do what you do? That's also a question that we ask all the guests, and it's not specific to you. What's the source of motivation or the values behind?
I think I think I always liked telling stories. I mean, not as a novelist. I mean, stories, researching stories. That's why also for a long time I would have actually liked to have become a journalist, but it didn't work out. So then I had to stay in academia. But I think the larger, the deeper reason, which is something that only I became aware of recently, I mean, my family history is, of course, also a transatlantic history. So, I mean, one part of my family is deep roots here in Switzerland. Another part of my family is from Peru, right? So, but for a long time, because we were talking about this, the way in which history is taught, not only in schools, but at university, for a long time, it is very Eurocentric or even Swiss-centric. So, but I couldn't articulate this for a long time, but I had a sense, I mean, something it's missing. I always felt, I mean, on one hand, it interested me, but on the other hand, I always felt a little bit, how to say, not at ease, or I don't really fully belong here. And it's only then through getting to know other people at university who had like similar kind of biographies as I have, also kind of transnational, or also, I mean, families from, family histories outside of Europe. And then there's also this huge paradigm shift that then took place in academia with post-colonial studies and all this stuff, that I became aware, yes, I mean, there is one of the reasons that not only I, but many of us kind of feel ill at ease in this, the way in which we in Switzerland talk about our history, but also about our present position in the world. It's extremely one-sided, and so then me, and I'm not the only one, but then I think this is one of the sources of my motivation, is to kind of, there is more to Swiss history, or there's like another side, or maybe the largest. Maybe we've only been taught maybe 20% of Swiss history, because 80% of Swiss history took place elsewhere. So this is then a huge motivation to research kind of this unknown, or this part of history which is unknown to us in Switzerland.
I also always open a space for maybe other passions or topics that the guests can profit from. Like we've discussed, obviously, your field of expertise, which is your research and your work. But are there other subjects you may wish to go into and share?
No, I'm afraid I'm a pretty regular, boring. I mean, being a historian is not a profession; it's a way of life. So I think,
yeah, that's really.
But I mean,
interesting.
But I mean, but it's kind of also enhances life. I mean, it's so. I mean, no, I'm passionate. I don't know if it's a passion, but I mean, my wife, incidentally, who is a historian also.
Okay.
And of course, we love traveling, and we love. We love going for hikes. We love traveling a lot, but of course there also, I mean, we don't, it's, it's not like a switch. We remain historians. So through traveling, through also walking, going to other places, then is also then discovering new histories, but also discovering then other perspectives. I mean, as I mentioned, I just came back from a long travel in Peru and in Brazil, and this was fascinating. Although I'm not a specialist on these regions, but it's just, something that I really missed during COVID when you couldn't travel, is kind of decentering myself. I'm sorry, my answer is probably
it's fine.
Very academic again, but it is also, but it involves, it has also it's not only an intellectual, it has being there, experience, for example, tropical humidity, and then getting another understanding how it must have been for, colonists and all the, stuff like that.
Sure.
But also, it's essential aspect. I mean, particularly in Brazil, the food, the music, I mean, it's just before Carnival, the role of salsa, I mean, and the drum beats. But of course, then also realizing again, I mean, the role, the function that salsa also has then in this history and the legacies of slavery in Brazil. So it's always both. It's sensual, it's fun, it's drinking, it's eating, listening to music. But yeah, at the end of the day, I'm afraid I always stay historian.
I was wondering because I get to know you existed through there was a conference you gave for Solidarité, which is far left, I don't know, radical left, far left. I don't really like in any way the etiquette or the ideology. I'm some pathetic. Obviously, I'm more radical left, I would say. But does the work of historians has an impact of your political perspective?
Well,
do you think?
Well, it's both. I mean, the work of historian is always political. I mean, I think, sort of in older kind of philosophies of science, there was this idea of objectivity, and the scientist or the historian has to be objective, has to be above everything. Like
As
God.
If it's possible.
Like God, yes. And I think, unfortunately, still many colleagues have these kind of ideas. But now I think, the newer epistemologies, which I am, of course, part of, introduced mainly, and one must say, it's very important to always mention this again, by feminist scholars, feminist theories, post-colonial, etc. and so forth. It's about positionality. So you are kind of, also as a historian, you have a certain position in a space which is structured through power and inequalities. So in that sense, even if you are aware or not aware, the way in which the questions that you ask as a scientist or as historians to the past, and then the stories that you tell resulting from these questions, can never be objective stories. They always privilege a certain kind of perspective, a perspective that is situated in a space of unequally distributed power. So therefore, to become, let's say, to kind of shift from a unreflective, maybe, you have a huge difference of power. And therefore, I would say, yes, definitely I am probably a critical historian. I see the role of the historian should be, and this is then a kind of a position, I would say, that's also rooted in European thinking of the Enlightenment, etc. and so forth, is to kind of not intensify divisions, but try and lesser divisions, try to build conversations and also try to highlight historical experiences and historical perspectives that are missing in the so-called master narratives. So I think in that sense, I mean, we all have then our hobby horses. I mean, I am then particularly interested in imperial history and colonial history. Therefore, the category of race is particularly relevant for me. But I do also try to take into account, which is very important, the gender aspects, but also then social inequalities and other aspects, also sexuality. I mean, I also worked previously, my PhD was also a contribution actually to the still very, very neglected history of homosexuality or male-male friendships in Switzerland.
Can you, in a nutshell, tell a little bit more about that? That's very interesting.
Yeah, but this is then became a then it's also historical research. Oftentimes, then I don't like the term when many colleagues like complicates things, and actually I don't like complicating things. I like simplifying things, but in a certain degree, history is complicated. So I looked at two Swiss explorers, Paul and Fritz Sarrazin from Basel, who came from this haute bourgeoisie, these very, very wealthy families, who traveled and did scientific research in the Dutch Empire, and thereby inadvertently helped the Dutch conquer their empire. So it's kind of this story of Swiss involvements and how the Swiss scientific establishment was involved, for example, in the empire building project of the Dutch. But then during my research, I also discovered that they were kind of these, and the sources are of course not clear, in the 19th century, friends. They also spoke of themselves as friends, and they spent, I mean, almost their whole life together. And when they were not together, then they wrote these very, very emotional letters to each other. So they were also then perceived by the other part of the Basel elite as kind of the word that was used is Geistesehe. So it was like a marriage, but not like a normal marriage, a spiritual marriage. So most likely, I mean, today we would probably say they had a homosexual relationship, but of course, as a historian, I cannot see if they had like a physical intimate relationship. But it is very, very clear that they kind of had a way of life, or their friendship was really stood in contradiction to the model of at the time of heterosexuality. So in a sense, and this then makes it complicated. On the one hand, they benefited from all this imperial power, and they also inadvertently contributed to imperial power. But on the other hand, they were also kind of trying to carve out a lifestyle which was stigmatized and discriminated at the time. And one of the ways they thought they could do it is to leave this highly conservative city of Basel and spend years and years and years in Sri Lanka and on these Dutch islands in the Dutch Indies.
Wow. And that's, again, tell us that everything is so complex, and what I find the best to navigate is to just keep your curiosity. And that's really the theme of this podcast is be curious, hear everyone out with a critical here, obviously. And I think you fitted perfectly this atmosphere. I see some researchers that are still very curious, but in the same time engaged, and that was really an interesting conversation, and thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was really a joy. Pleasure.
And to everyone who is listening, thank you very much. You can support us with the little what do you call that? Thumbs ups, or comments, or sharing the video. That will help a lot. Thank you very much for everything, and see you next time. Thank you, Bernhard Carlos Schär. Happy day for you today.
To you too. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Cheers.